Well, for some analysis, we're now joined by Dr. Awol Allo, who's a senior lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Kiel in the United Kingdom. Dr. Allo, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
This conflict has been going on for months now. Why do you think it's taken this long for the United States to show some actions?
Well, you remember back in November of last year when this conflict started, the Ethiopian government told the Ethiopian public and the world that this is going to be a very brief law enforcement operation that will last about 3 months, and it would be very limited in its scope. It would have a very limited objective, and these objectives would be achievable. 11 months ago, the conflict is still ongoing with significant ramification for the population who live in Tigray and in the surrounding area, but also for peace and security in the region, to the point that now the United States is publicly stating that what is happening in Ethiopia and in the region constitutes a national security threat to the United States interest. So this is where we are. And I think the United States, has engaged with the Ethiopian government on this particular conflict in ways that it doesn't usually engage in most African countries when significant problems of human rights, various forms of abuse take place. But I think the various tools that it has deployed so far, economic pressure, military pressure, through those previous sanctions, through the UN, G7, those have not really resulted in the kind of negotiated settlement that the United States wanted. And now I think the United States is moving to the next step where it is exploring much broader, more aggressive steps to force the parties to come to the negotiating table and also provide access to the extremely needed humanitarian assistance to the people on the ground.
The United States language was sanctions on whoever is responsible for these atrocities. Addis Ababa is taking it to mean their government, but it's not just them that the United States might be looking at, or is it?
I think absolutely the sanctions regime is very broad in its scope. It very specifically states that Ethiopian government officials and various entities that are affiliated with the government, even non-governmental entities that are in some ways providing support or inhibiting the possibility of a negotiated settlement, not just those related to the Ethiopian government, but also the TPLF, the Eritrean government, and entities that are connected to the Eritrean government and to the Tigrayan regional government as well. But obviously, the Ethiopian government feels that it has been singled out in terms of how pressure was exerted by the international community, not just the United States. And there's this constant denial about the ways in which the Ethiopian government went about prosecuting the war. And I think that is mostly what comes through in this response that the Prime Minister put out today.
The Ethiopian Prime Minister said that they would not succumb to what he terms consequences of pressure engineered by disgruntled individuals. Who does he mean?
It's not quite clear. I mean, there is quite a lot in that letter that seemed very unhinged to me, and also really doesn't seem to have taken account of what's actually going on the ground. People are suffering, ordinary people are suffering. In Tigray, about 5 million people are in need of emergency assistance. About 900,000 people are in what the United States government is describing as a famine-like situation. In the same way, in the Oromia region, in the Amhara region, in the Afar region, there are a significant number of people who need humanitarian assistance. The economy in the country is in free fall. People are suffering. So for the Prime Minister to simply state that the country would not be pressured by countries such as the United States, the Europeans, who have significant tools at their disposal, I think that doesn't seem to have taken the realities on the ground into account. But I think what the United States is saying in this case is that the only way to solve this problem is through political means. There can be no military solution. I think it's not just the United States, countries in the region, significant number of individuals, independent observers who look at Ethiopia agree with the notion that there can be no military solution. There has to be a negotiated settlement. And the United States is saying, we are prepared to use these tools at our disposal to pressure the parties to come to a negotiated settlement. So the response on the part of the government, I think, is very much reflective of the kind of hysteria, the kind of delusion, I think, that gripped the Ethiopian state, particularly the pro-war war camp.
The Tigrayans are seen as the victims largely in this conflict, but we are seeing Tigrayan forces pushing south, particularly in areas like Amhara, where there were already disputes about certain areas and territories. Are we now seeing a conflation of issues in this movement, and what does it mean to the equation?
I think there is a lot of false equivalence that is being drawn in terms of how the various atrocities that are being reported are presented to the public. There are very clearly reports from credible international human rights organizations that indicate that some atrocities have been committed by Tigrayan forces. So if we accept what Amnesty International Human Rights Watch tell us about the Ethiopian government and the conduct of its forces, we should be prepared to accept what they tell us about the other entities that are involved in this conflict as well. So there are reports that are coming saying the Tigrayan forces are also responsible for some atrocities. But I think the scale of these atrocities is such that the conduct of the Ethiopian government, the Eritrean government in Tigray cannot really be equated with the reports that I have seen and attributed to the Tigrayan forces.
Could these sanctions extend to Abiy Ahmed himself, because he is the commander-in-chief?
Well, politically speaking, if the United States wants to continue to engage with the Ethiopian government, I think it would make it very difficult for itself to sanction the head of the government, but of course, when you look at the language of the sanctions, it basically refers to Ethiopian government officials, so that includes the head of government as well. But in most cases, the tradition has been that the sanctions are not really imposed on the head of the government, at least while they are in office. Also because there are questions around head of state immunity in international law, the fact that those individuals, insofar as they are head of government, need to have some space and freedom to conduct the affair of the state and the government on behalf of those people. So while the language is very generic, as an official that is responsible for directing the government, he could fall within that language. But in practice, I don't think they will go that far and sanction the head of government himself.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed may be feeling emboldened by recent election wins, but I'm sure he does feel the pressure, and I wonder if that will translate into perhaps sticking to his guns and refusing to back down. If we look at the language he's using with the United States, this doesn't sound like someone who's going to respond positively to any kind of threat.
Well, I think one of the things that we seem to have forgotten now is the nature of those elections. The Prime Minister claimed to have won in a landslide, but that was an election where key opposition groups have been excluded from the election. Some of them boycotted, some of them were literally excluded. The election was not held in some parts of the country, such as in Tigray, for example. So the legitimacy question, the cloud of legitimacy that has been hanging over the head of the Prime Minister will continue, because a significant portion of the people in the country do not see that election as a legitimate election where various opposition groups in the country, various voices in the country were represented, were given the space to campaign and run for election and be voted or voted out. People did not have that opportunity. So at least the international community may have forgotten, but I think the majority of the Ethiopian people would know what happened. So I think that when it comes to the question of legitimacy, the Prime Minister still faces a significant challenge. So he is trying to leverage, you're absolutely right, he's trying to leverage what he described as a democratic election that have never been seen in the history of the country. But I think international actors and everybody knows that was a highly questionable election where the Prime Minister effectively ran against himself.
Before this conflict escalated between Mekele and Addis, there were talks back then that these two sides needed to sit down and negotiate for a settlement going forwards. Are we past that point now? I mean, are we now at a point where the only solution for Tigray is secession and the only solution for Addis is a complete annexation?
That's a really important question because before the war, a lot of people were hopeful that there was at least the potential for the two forces, for the two sides to come together and agree a negotiated settlement. It wasn't impossible at that point. But I think once you entered the territory of an armed conflict, particularly the armed conflict of the sort that we have seen over the course of the last 11 years, where it's not just significant level of violence against the civilians, but also a significant rhetoric of hate, of dehumanization against one another, to the point that it is very difficult at this point to see how these two forces could come together, sit around the table, actually discuss the future. It really is very difficult. And I think what you see in the letter, in the letter put out by the Prime Minister, is precisely, I think, an expression of how little desire there is on the part of the government. I think you can see the same on the other side as well. I think the other side is saying, because, when a particular group is up against the state, obviously you are looking at significant asymmetries in terms of power. So the Tigrayan side has been saying that we are willing to negotiate provided that these reasonable conditions are met. The Ethiopian government's position is that we cannot negotiate with terrorist organizations because they have declared them as terrorist entities. But I think the war, the violence, the hatred, very genocidal language that is used by higher level Ethiopian officials in particular, I think that has made it very, very difficult for a negotiated settlement to this problem. A lot of the Tigrayans, I think ordinary people, seem to believe at this point that their future lies outside the Ethiopian state, but in practice, how that would work and whether the Tigrayan leadership actually takes that as a serious and credible alternative, I think that's a slightly difficult question to decide at this point. But I think the position of the population seems that they see their future outside Ethiopia, mainly because of the way in which Ethiopia treated its own people, inviting a foreign enemy from another country and allowing them to punish the civilian population. So basically two things, right? One, I think the war has made a negotiated settlement very, very difficult. Two, even if there was some kind of negotiated settlement to end the hostilities, I think it is very difficult to see how these two forces and the various stakeholders in the Ethiopian state would come together and agree on a deal for the future of the Ethiopian state. I think that is very, very difficult at this point.
All right, and we didn't even get to touch on what the repercussions might be for other parts of Ethiopia that are watching carefully what's happening in Tigray and perhaps feeling that the time is right for their causes to come to the fore. But we'll talk about that another time. Today, I just want to say thank you very much indeed for joining us, and your insights always greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.